e a dor se inflama voraz. Consumição numa fogueira de amor.
Hello everybody, Dr. Vasquez here. What we're going to do right now is look at a few vitamin D articles. And I suppose in part my reason for wanting to do this is to show two different things. One is to show the importance of each individual article, So, a lot of times we want to have the overview of a given topic, and of course that's important. But the best way to get to an accurate overview, of course, is to look at a lot of small details. So, a way to have an overview of the topic without appreciating the details would be to simply read review articles. But on the other hand, the approach that I take is to try to look at everything. And sometimes that's a big review article, and sometimes that's small case reports like the one I'm going to look at right now. So, in order to have a really nuanced and detailed perspective on something, we have to look at, the big consensus documents. And that's not to say we have to look at those and agree with them. Sometimes the big consensus arguments or documents, for example, from the Endocrine Society, sometimes those big articles are total bullshit. And it's because those organizations are political organizations. They're not truly medical or clinical organizations. So again, the best way to have a nuanced overview is to look at, the big research articles, the big reviews, things like that. But a lot of times those are politically motivated. So, we have to look at smaller articles as well. So I'm going to look at a few articles right now. And so that was one of the points that I wanted to make is, to develop a higher level of sophistication and expertise. Again, that takes looking at a lot of research, not just the big articles and not just the big textbooks. But the other motivation I have for doing this particular video on vitamin D, I actually have been thinking about talking about thyroid and testosterone and hormones lately, but I'm starting the morning with this. The other, negative inspiration, which is inspiring me to talk about this right now, is because I saw somebody replied to me the other day. Of course I deleted it, but somebody replied to me talking about how vitamin D was rat poison or something like that. And I just thought, people who say that kind of stuff are just so completely stupid. I mean, they don't even warrant a decent reply. And I'm sure that what I just said offends some of you, but that's okay. Sometimes offensive things need to be said. So I'm going to talk about vitamin D right now, and I'm going to show you some articles that have kind of stayed in my mind literally for decades. Like this article right here. I remember photocopying this in the library as a paper document. I mean, nobody goes to the library anymore, hardly, and nobody photocopies articles. I mean, I used to spend hours photocopying articles, and I was a medical library machine. I mean, I had systems. I used to spend a lot of time at OHSU. That was the medical library in Portland. University of Washington, of course, had a big medical library. I used to spend hours, virtually almost days there. And then Texas Medical Center has a really wonderful medical library as well. Anyway, that's probably where I photocopied this. So this is a good article. And again, in case I haven't offended enough people to start off my morning. Again, like when people say, oh, well, vitamin D is just rat poison and you shouldn't take it and you should rely on sunshine and all that stupid stuff. I mean, those people are living in a fantasy world. And here's an example, like here's a patient who was wheelchair bound and I believe, living in the UK. So not only can she not get outside, she can't get outside probably. I mean, come on. Somebody in a wheelchair isn't going to go outside and then take all their clothes off and sunbathe. So again, when people talk negatively about vitamin D, a lot of times they're so out of touch with reality. It's like they don't even warrant an argument. So, like for a woman like this, she's wheelchair bound. She's got multiple health problems. She's not going to go lay out in the sun. It's just physically impossible for her. So anyway, let's look at this case. This is a case, again, this case always stayed with me. Title of this, as you can see, is The Woman Who Left Her Wheelchair. This was published in The Lancet back when The Lancet was actually a good journal. So The Lancet used to be arguably the best medical journal and very progressive and, good British intellect and all that kind of stuff. Now it's just a tabloid. But anyway, let's look at this article real quick. It's just a case report. 32-year-old woman admitted to the hospital with progressive muscular weakness of her legs and diffuse skeletal pain. It's exactly what you would expect with vitamin D deficiency. That's quite advanced. She went about on crutches and or in a wheelchair. About 2 years earlier, she had some pain and she had a disc injury. A lot of people have disc injuries. So the problem is, if somebody has pain and a disc injury, a lot of times the doctors will say, oh, well, you have pain because of your disc injury. And that's obviously not the case. So this woman, as I recall, had inflammatory bowel disease. Yeah, here it is. Inflammatory bowel disease. And she had part of her bowel resected. See, I remember this. I read this article 20 years ago. I read this article 21 years ago. So she's got Crohn's disease. So she's going to have nutritional deficiencies and malabsorption, especially with a small bowel resection. And so look at the clinical picture here. She's got inflammatory bowel disease. So she's not going to have good nutritional status because of her nutrient malabsorption. And on top of that, she had part of her bowel taken out. And on top of that, she's been treated with steroids. Steroids promote vitamin D deficiency because they increase the catabolism of vitamin D. So, yeah, that's going to be the long story short here. Of course, you don't know that looking at the title of the article. It just says, A Woman Who Left Her Wheelchair. But this is a case of severe vitamin D deficiency. When more than 1 meter, when more than 1 meter of ileum is resected, steatorrhea, fat malabsorption, and increased risk for deficiency with fat-soluble nutrients such as vitamin D. So they looked at her vitamin D level here, and it was 2.4, and it should have been 50. At least she has measurable vitamin D. The first vitamin D test that I ever did was in Houston, Texas. This was a Mexican-American woman who was a janitor in a warehouse. And I gave her the test for free. Because back then we were paying $120 for each vitamin D test. Now it's like $40 or something like that. So this was a Mexican-American janitor working in a warehouse. She got the vitamin D test for free, and her vitamin D level was undetectable. Of course, I wish I had saved the report. But her vitamin D level was undetectable. This woman at least has 2.4, so she got a little bit of vitamin D. So this is also interesting. She was given metronidazole for treatment of bacterial overgrowth. So that's another cause of nutrient malabsorption. So she's got Crohn's, resection, steroids, and bacterial overgrowth. So she's going to have massive nutrient deficiencies. Perhaps most obviously, it's not even most obviously, but perhaps most obviously vitamin D. She's probably deficient in zinc and magnesium and carotenoids and everything else too. The clinical picture was determined by hypovitaminosis D due to selective fat malabsorption. She has total fat malabsorption due to bowel resection and the steroids. She was given 125 dihydroxyvitamin D. That was a mistake, but at least it worked. But again, this was back in 1997, so this was almost 30 years ago. So they just didn't know much about vitamin D back then, But at least they gave her some vitamin D. She was given an injection with 125 dihydroxyvitamin D. After 3 weeks, she could walk again, and muscle weakness and bone pain had disappeared. In 3 weeks. And her total body bone scan was normal. You can see her bone scan here is a bit hot, as we would say. So bone scans simply reflect increased metabolic activity. It doesn't tell you why. But in this case, they're attributing some of her increased metabolic activity in her bones to vitamin D deficiency. And you can see it improved here. It's not a huge difference in my opinion, but that's what they did. So again, when people argue, it's not even an argument. It's just total stupidity. They're just repeating some stupid stuff. I presume that drug companies and governments and the globalists are paying people to disseminate misinformation, and one of the many tentacles and branches of that misinformation is to discredit vitamin D, because vitamin D is awesome for chronic pain, depression, anxiety, autoimmunity, and inflammatory diseases, infections, etc. And this is an example of chronic pain and muscle weakness practically immediately alleviated by vitamin D. And again, they didn't even do it right, but it still worked. After 3 weeks, she could walk again, and muscle weakness and bone pain had disappeared. So this is someone who was completely disabled, using crutches and a wheelchair, and in 3 weeks, she was cured of those problems just with vitamin D and a little bit of dietary recommendations, which was, again, pretty weak. So, this isn't even great management, but it still worked. But it proves, this one case proves, one case report can't prove everything, but this does establish and prove and provide evidence for the occasionally miraculous benefits of vitamin D. Let's look at another article here. This is a really nice article as well. Again, published back in the early 2000s. This is 2003, published in Spine, one of the most well-respected orthopedic journals on the planet. Vitamin D deficiency and chronic low back pain in Saudi Arabia. So this segues from the theme that we just looked at, which is chronic pain and chronic weakness. Fantastic article here. What they showed, they took a group of patients with chronic low back pain, 90% women, 10% men. Trying to see how many. 360 patients. 360, that's a lot of people. So I don't think this was a double-blind study. It was an open study. But if you've got an open study with nearly, I wanted to say almost 400, but 360 patients. If you have an open study with 360 patients, all with chronic diagnosis that's stable, and you cure virtually 100% of them, then yeah, even though it's not a placebo-controlled study, it's still massive. 83% of the patients, sorry, my neighbor's dogs are barking if you hear that in the background. 83% of study patients had an abnormally low level of vitamin D. After treatment with vitamin D, clinical improvement in symptoms was seen in all of the groups that had low vitamin D and in 95% of all the patients. So if you have a cure rate of 95% for a chronic stable disease, even if it's not a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled study, it's still pretty massive. And, like I said, it was published in a major journal. Their conclusions. Vitamin D deficiency is a major contributor to chronic low back pain worldwide. Screening for vitamin D deficiency and treating with supplements should be mandatory. So you can see also here, I don't think the second page really says much. Other than that, the treatment was safe. Let's see what their final conclusion is. Key points, and then I'm going to bounce back up and we'll talk about the treatment that they used. Chronic idiopathic low back pain is commonly caused by vitamin D deficiency in the entire world, not just in Saudi Arabia, especially among female patients. Patient response to oral vitamin D therapy is quite rewarding. Yeah, 95% success rate. Screening for vitamin D deficiency should be performed for all patients with chronic low back pain. Yeah. So, sorry, I'm going to close the window because my neighbor's dogs keep barking. But that's what they do on Sunday. So let's talk about the vitamin D that was used here. Looks like this was it. They used vitamin D in the form of 25-hydroxy vitamin D. That's the active storage form. 5,000 to 10,000 international units per day. So I don't recall the conversion right now, but this is obviously the better form of vitamin D to use, especially if you want faster results. I don't think it converts unit per unit with cholecalciferol or the common vitamin D3. I think this is actually more potent, but I also don't think that the difference is that big. But this is what they used. They did not use D3. They used 25-hydroxy D3, and that's fine. It didn't really matter. I mean, this is the form of vitamin D that should be used when you want really fast results. In this case, they're not looking for really fast results, but that's what they did. Anyway, this is another spectacular article that could have and should have changed the medical paradigm such that all patients with chronic pain are screened for and treated with vitamin D. So anyway, yeah, that's a spectacular article. So again, like I said, when I see people comment, and I have to presume these people are just colossally ignorant or they're being paid to be stupid. But when they say, oh, vitamin D is rat poison and vitamin D doesn't work and you should get out in the sun. I mean, come on, this is Saudi Arabia. You think these people don't have enough sun? At least they have access to it. But again, for cultural reasons, I mean, a Muslim woman in Saudi Arabia is probably not going to go, take most of her clothes off in the middle of the day and go sunbathing. I mean, so, the idea that people should just get sunbathing, I mean, that's really, it's absurd. It's to the point of being kind of nonsense. I mean, most people can't do that. A lot of people, for cultural or logistical reasons, they can't go out and just lay out in the sun. I mean, it's a little bit elitist to think that people have so much free time they can just go lay out in the sun anytime they want. I mean, the percentage of the population globally that can actually afford to do that and have good access to, quality sunshine, I mean, it's probably less than 5% or certainly less than 10%. So again, it's just not practical. Vitamin D supplements certainly work. We do get vitamin D, of course, from the sunshine, and that's great. But we also get a lot of other benefits and a lot of other metabolites. So I'm not saying that, taking a vitamin D pill is exactly equivalent to getting sunshine, but it's a very reasonable alternative for when people don't have options. And it works. I mean, you're looking at the evidence. So it definitely works. And no, it's not rat poison. I just happened to have seen this article when I was looking for the others. Let's see if I want to talk about that. Let me do these in chronological order. So let's do this one first. also from the Lancet. Again, this was back when the Lancet was actually a good journal. Intake of vitamin D and the risk of type 1 diabetes. Fantastic article that should have changed. This one article could have changed the entire practice of pediatrics globally. One article. Now, of course, somebody would want to, confirm these findings and all that, and that's fine. But this one article could have changed pediatric care throughout the world just from one article. Now, again, typically in medicine and clinical care and nutrition and all that, we don't want to base, our entire paradigm or practice on one article. So let's look at the options here. Let's do the false dichotomy. I love using false dichotomies as decision-making tools within the context of appreciating that it's a false dichotomy. But here it is. Check this out. Let's say that this article is published as it was, and it's a brilliant article. They had 30 years of follow-up. Again, it's not a placebo-controlled study. You know why doctors talk about placebo-controlled studies so much? And why it's considered the gold standard? It's because that's what drug companies use. So most doctors can't think for themselves. And so one way to eliminate a big group of research articles, one way to eliminate having to read them and think about them and incorporate them is to just say, oh, well, it wasn't a double-blind placebo-controlled study, so I'm not even going to read it. Well, that's a logical fallacy designed to basically conserve time. And I guess for them it works. I don't really structure my work around trying to save time. I try to structure my work around being good and accurate. And so, yeah, this isn't a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, but it was huge. It was conducted over the course of 30 years of follow-up, which is a hell of a lot better than you get from a lot of those drug studies. And like I said, an article like this gets published and you've got two choices. You can either take action on what they said, or you can sit on your hands and do nothing. So, again, as I've said before, one of the ways that we should make decisions in clinical care and medicine and nutrition and healthcare and public health is you look at risk-benefit ratios. So the risk of using vitamin D in this way, in this population, was 0, and the benefit was massive. So, not everything in the world in clinical care is determined by is determined by double-blind placebo-controlled studies. I mean, you have to look at other factors, not just massive studies. Because again, the big studies are big. Mostly, it's not simply because they're trying to look at how much it works in the population. Most drug effects are actually quite small. And so in order to reach statistical significance, to show that their product worked or provided any benefit whatsoever, in order to prove that at the level of 0.05 p-values, in order to do that, they have to have big populations because they're looking for very small changes. That's why drug studies funded by drug companies tend to be very large, because they're looking for minuscule benefit. In contrast, for example, a lot of nutritional studies are smaller because the benefit is greater per patient, and that's why they don't need to have huge studies, because the clinical benefit is actually more obvious. So in this study, regardless, look at this. This is just huge. They had more than 10,000 patients in this study, 10,000, and more than 10,000 included in the final analysis. Children who took the recommended dose of vitamin D at 2,000 international units per day had a relative risk of 0.22 for type 1 diabetes. So they had a relative risk, which more casually communicated is a 78% reduction in type 1 diabetes. They had a 78% reduction in their risk for type 1 diabetes just by using 2,000 international units of vitamin D per day. So, that's huge. They found a dose-response relationship. Patients who received, like, let's say the mom forgot to give, or the dad. Let's say the parents or the caretakers, whatever. Let's say the kids didn't get their vitamin D. So what they found here was a dose-response relationship. Those tend to imply causality. So it's another way of reinforcing the benefit of the data here. Vitamin D, sometimes they use cod liver oil. And that's fine. So, but again, this is an article that should have changed the practice of pediatrics. And it's another example for when people say, oh, well, vitamin D is rat poison. Again, people who say that are completely ignorant. And I have to guess that some of them are being paid off by the drug companies or the globalists to keep people stupid and confused. But if you look at the real data, like I do, then, this is massive. So, let's say you're a pediatrician. You can either take action on this or not, and this was published, in the, 2001, but they started this study back in the 1960s. Because like I said, 1966 is when they started the study. I mean, this is just incredible. I mean, the amount of foresight that they had to even ask these questions was just incredible. So they started this back in 1966. They had 30 years of follow-up. And then, of course, they needed a few years to analyze the data. Incredible, incredible. So if you're a pediatrician, you can act on this or not. You can say, oh, well, no, I need a different study. You're not going to get more than 10,000 subjects in a study. I mean, that's just incredible. They found dose-response relationships, complete safety, massive benefit. And I think they may have reanalyzed this data to also show reductions in other diseases like schizophrenia, for example. It's just incredible. All right, so let's look at another article. So like I said, I was looking for those articles that I already looked at, those first three. And then, of course, I saw this one as I was going through my folders. This was published early in the pandemic. So this is August. Look at this. August of 2020. We were still living in Spain at the time. The pandemic is going. They're starting to enforce, social distancing, mandatory face masks, quarantines. We had already lived through, 4 months of quarantine. We couldn't even leave the house except to buy food. It's just stupid. They closed all the gyms. They closed all the parks. But the alcohol stores and the tobacco stores stayed open. That's one of the ways I knew this was bullshit. I mean, if it was a real global pandemic and public health emergency, they're not going to close the gyms and close the parks and then leave the tobacco stores open. Oh, so you can't congregate in a gym and you can't congregate, it's not even congregation. I mean, you can't even go to the park. Oh, but you can go buy tobacco in a small store that's like, 3 feet, some of them are actually 3 feet. I mean, they're just windows in Spain because they're all managed by the government. It's just incredible, the level of stupidity. Anyway, effect of vitamin D treatment and best available therapy versus best available therapy by itself on intensive COVID. So yeah, I mean, they knocked this one out of the park. Let me make the picture just a little bigger on the screen. Yeah, sorry, there we go. Well, that's going to be filling up the frame. Oh, I'm sorry, that's too big. Let me make it smaller. There we are. Our pilot study demonstrated that administration of high-dose cholecalciferol or 25-hydroxyvitamin D, a main metabolite of vitamin D endocrine system, significantly reduced the need for ICU treatment of patients requiring hospitalization due to proven COVID. Calcifediol seems to be able to reduce severity of illness, but larger trials with more groups are necessary, and that's fine. So again, this was published in Spain. I think this was in Cordoba, and they did follow this up. They followed it up 2 other times in Spain, and then in India, and then another study in Mexico. Just amazing. So I reviewed all of these vitamin D clinical trials in the vitamin D video that you can access at the bottom of the page. Or maybe I'll include the summary of that in the video, in this particular video, or something like that. Anyway, I mean, the benefits of vitamin D monotherapy, just using it as a single treatment, even if it might be compared within groups that are also receiving other treatments. I mean, vitamin D monotherapy is commonly miraculous. I mean, look at that woman who got out of her wheelchair. Look at a 95% cure rate on vitamin D in the Saudi Arabia study. What was it, 78% reduction in type 1 diabetes. I mean, the benefits are just huge. So again, when researchers or, social media influencers start talking smack about how you shouldn't use vitamin D, or you should get out in the sun, or whatever, I mean, it's just stupid. So they're either completely dumb and or completely ignorant, or they're just being paid off to propagandize the population. Let's see, I have a few different copies of this article. That's why the rest of it's not highlighted. But obviously I reviewed it in the video. Let's see, I'm just looking to see if they show anything. I would like to see a graph of their results. I made a graph of their results, but apparently they didn't. Showing the benefit, it was like a 78% reduction in death and intensive care unit use, either in this study or another. Let's see what the results actually showed. But they didn't graph it, but I did make a graph. And you're looking at a graph like this. Like, these are the people who didn't get vitamin D, like their death rate and their hospital expenses and things like that. And the people who got vitamin D, which costs like $20, they had much less use of ICU and respirators and other drugs and things like that. In Spain, we could buy vitamin D over the counter in this form, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, calcifediol. Let's see. Let me just see what the results were. That might be it. Yeah, so they talk about their results. It's, I wish they had used a different language, but they did this the way that they did. Anyway, the results were massive. And again, it's just, the only difference in therapeutics was giving people vitamin D. So again, don't listen to people who say vitamin D is rat poison. I mean, come on, it's just ridiculous. That means we all have rat poison in us. I mean, what a stupid thing that would be to believe. Obviously, it works as monotherapy. I have to think some of those people are just psychopathically ignorant, or they're being paid off to be misinformers. But again, like I said before, the idea that people are going to go out and get, all their vitamin D needs met by sunshine, I mean, that's also ignorant, because geographically it doesn't work. Culturally, it doesn't work. Economically, it doesn't work. I mean, most people can't take off work in the middle of the day to go sunbathe, and it's just impractical. So yeah, you can get a lot of benefits from taking a vitamin D supplement. I'm not saying it's exactly the same as laying out in the sun, but nothing is exactly the same as laying out in the sun. That's why it's called sunbathing. I mean, I'm not trying to make it sound like you're getting sunbathing in a pill, but you're also not getting, a lot of ultraviolet radiation damage as well. So it has its positive and negative components. But anyway, that's my quick video. Obviously, I need to go eat breakfast, and I'm going to go eat breakfast right now. But I wanted to get this quick video out there for those of you who may have some interest. Hope you're all doing well. Take care. And like I said, if I can find that other video that I did where I talked about the main conclusions of the vitamin D studies against COVID, if I can find that and add it at the end of this, then I'll do that just for the sake of convenience for all of you. On one hand, I could do that. On the other hand, I don't want to do it, because then that ignores the data that I also reviewed in video format on chronic pain, depression, anxiety, inflammation, coagulation, barriers, and other benefits. So, I don't want to add that information as if I'm just saying, well, it's only good for this. I mean, vitamin D is good for lots of different things, but I think you've got that by now. So I hope you're all doing well. Take care. Bye. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Alex Vasquez with part 5 in my clinical review of vitamin D deficiency in adults, this time focusing on nutritional neglect versus antimicrobial defense. These are, without any doubt whatsoever, the 4 major pillars of what we call clinical ethics or medical ethics. Now, we could extend this list to include a few others. Sometimes the list goes to 7, but the 4 indisputable basic pillars of medical ethics are non-malfeasance, beneficence, justice, and autonomy, which includes informed consent. So, how does vitamin D play into this model? Well, we know that vitamin D strengthens barriers, it strengthens the epithelial cells, and it also increases antimicrobial peptide production, in this case including secretory IgA, which is the immune globulin on mucosal surfaces, such as the gastrointestinal tract, genitourinary tract, oral cavity, and respiratory tract, including the lungs. Furthermore, we know that vitamin D strengthens tight junctions between the cells and also improves the microbiome, and that, of course, has effects throughout the entire body. In various models, 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D inhibits viral replication, and we know that it also inhibits the transcription factor NF-kappa B, which participates in viral replication as well. As I showed you in video number 4, vitamin D also inhibits or modulates and lowers tumor necrosis factor alpha, which is an endogenous factor, it's a cytokine, that actually stimulates viral replication. So if we can modulate that or lower that or control that with vitamin D, then of course that would indirectly inhibit viral replication, and that would give the immune system kind of the upper hand or a strategic advantage. And what I'll show you right now is the new data showing that vitamin D functions as a mechanistic antiviral or a pharmacologic antiviral against the COVID-19 virus. Let's take a look at that right now from the American Journal of Physiology 2021. This was published in June. And let's focus on the title showing that vitamin D metabolites can inhibit the SARS-CoV-2 replication machinery enzymes. I'll read that to you one more time. Vitamin D metabolites can inhibit the SARS-CoV-2 replication machinery enzymes. Let's focus in on their research findings. Metabolites of vitamin D and pre-vitamin D produced in the skin following ultraviolet B exposure inhibited 2 key enzymes of the COVID-19 coronavirus. While 25-hydroxyvitamin D was impressively effective against both enzymes, other UVB-produced pre-D3 metabolites were also potent. And, as I say here in my own words, one could reasonably anticipate a synergistic or entourage effect. Now let me show you 2 tables from this article. Here in their table 1, they show binding affinities of various agents against the SARS-CoV enzyme Mpro, as they've stated here. And again, this is specific to a replicative enzyme used by the SARS-CoV-2 virus called Mpro. Now let's look at the evidence against another enzyme here. So this is binding affinity of various drugs and metabolites against the COVID-19 enzyme RDRP, again in comparison with some standard antiviral drugs. And lo and behold, we notice that 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which is the dominant metabolite of vitamin D in the blood, we notice that that particular metabolite is actually the most potent inhibitor or binder of this enzyme, again, in SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 virus, RDRP. 25-hydroxyvitamin D3 is something that we can increase in the serum very quickly through the use of nutritional supplementation. And again, it is the most potent metabolite against this particular enzyme of the COVID-19 virus, more effective than other vitamin D metabolites and more effective than all of the antiviral drugs tested in this model. So I invite you to take a look at that article if you have interest in it. Again, it was recently published, American Journal of Physiology, 2021 in June, again published by the American Physiological Society. So let's continue my diagram explanation here, again supporting the biological plausibility of vitamin D use against viral infections. So I've already discussed the acquisition step or the direct antiviral step. I talked about how vitamin D can directly and indirectly inhibit replication. Now let's talk about immunonutrition.
So we know that vitamin D improves antigen presentation, cell-mediated immunity, immune globulin-mediated immunity as well. And occasionally some studies have shown that vitamin D improves the response to vaccines, and that's what we would expect given what I've said above, and that is it improves antigen presentation as well as antibody-mediated immunity. And as I reviewed in great detail in video number 4, we know that vitamin D modulates or reduces inflammation. At the cellular and systemic level, we know that vitamin D supports mitochondrial function, reduces neuroinflammation, promotes inflammation resolution, also promotes glutathione formation and magnesium absorption, and that would provide some collateral benefits. And I also showed you in video number 4 a clinical study showing that vitamin D promotes recovery from virus infection and specifically the COVID-19 infection. And finally, with regard to cellular and systemic health, I also showed you in video number 1 how vitamin D alleviates chronic pain and pain amplification, and in video number 2, how vitamin D supplementation alleviates anxiety and depression. So I'm going to focus today on viral infections, but a lot of this information would be essentially the same for bacterial and fungal infections. So before we leave this page, I want everybody to focus in on what I had said before, and that is that vitamin D functions at virtually every level of non-specific defense, viral inhibition, and also immunity and systemic health. So again, in defense against an invading microbe, whether that's a fungus or a bacteria or a virus, the entire body has to work in unison. And that's why we're going to see our best clinical results from agents that improve health, defense, and resilience at every level, starting with the acquisition of the microbe. In the case of viruses, inhibiting viral replication, which occurs through human molecular machinery, and then again in response to all microbes, specific and non-specific defenses, and the cellular and systemic consequences and response. So again, the ideal agent, and in this case we're talking about vitamin D, would function at every level, blocking acquisition, blocking replication of viruses, supporting specific and non-specific immune defenses, and also supporting cellular and systemic health. Now again, this explains the biological plausibility of using vitamin D against infectious diseases. Let's add one more level of detail on the following page. Again, vitamin D functions at every level of barrier defense, inhibiting viral replication, also supporting innate and acquired immunity. Vitamin D also supports cellular and systemic health to reduce the burden, severity, frequency, and consequences of infectious diseases. And here I'll show you that vitamin D supplementation specifically increases production of interferon gamma. So interferon gamma is a cytokine, and the reason it's called interferon is because it interferes with viral replication. So again, if you're trying to explain this to yourself, to a patient, or to a professional colleague or a professional adversary, one of the things you could say, if they need something kind of focused, you could say, well, vitamin D improves gamma interferon production, and you know, of course, that the interferons block viral replication. So let's look at that here. From the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology, April 2020, vitamin D administration increases production of interferon gamma measured in the serum here. So I'll show you this article more, but I wanted to kind of foreshadow it in this conversation again on biological plausibility and mechanisms. If someone needs a specific mechanism beyond what I've already discussed, we can tell them that vitamin D supplementation increases production of interferon gamma and that interferon gamma has antiviral effects. So again, we've got kind of the biological plausibility here, and we have the clinical evidence here, and I have much more where this came from. So let's look at a few more details specific to vitamin D and interferon. I showed you this study previously in video number 4. We looked at this article from Cytokine 2015, showing that supplemental vitamin D increased levels of interferon gamma, and again, we know that interferon gamma is directly antiviral. So here's my definition of it. You can pause the video to take a read of that. But I want to show you a few highlights from a different article. This was published in Journal of Leukocyte Biology 2004. Again, the interferons are cytokines that famously interfere with viral replication. Interferon gamma also upregulates other aspects of the immune system for a more potent and efficient response to intracellular pathogens, and of course all viruses are intracellular pathogens. Interferon gamma specifically supports the Th1 or cell-mediated type of immune response, and again, that's what we would expect against an intracellular pathogen. And in video number 3, I talked about antimicrobial peptides and other kind of non-specific antimicrobial defenses, and we see that interferon gamma, which is supported by vitamin D supplementation, increases production of lysozyme defensins and cathelicidins. Those are the classic antimicrobial peptides. As I've said before, we want vitamin D levels to at least reach 40 nanograms per milliliter or 100 nanomoles per liter. This is what I published in 2004. More recently, I think we should aim for an optimal physiologic range of 50 to 90 nanograms per milliliter, also known as 125 to 225 nanomoles per liter. That is the normal physiologic range for sun-exposed humans. And to get people into that range, we should have started population-wide vitamin D supplementation at least 17 years ago after I published this article in 2004. By failing to provide population-wide vitamin D supplementation, we have invited pandemics of early death and infectious disease. So even though COVID-19 is obviously a new type of infection, the data on the relationship between COVID-19 and vitamin D is absolutely stunning and consistent and very, very robust. And now we actually have clinical evidence showing the benefit of vitamin D supplementation against COVID-19, even when patients are already presenting with symptoms, and actually some of them are being hospitalized for those symptoms. So we'll look at several different studies, but overall, the data is very robust. Innumerable publications have demonstrated that low 25-hydroxyvitamin D is a risk factor for the incidence, severity, and mortality of COVID-19 infection, but medical organizations and governments have done nothing while the entire world was on so-called lockdown, and hundreds of millions of lives were disrupted, hundreds of thousands of deaths due to neglect and suicide and depression. We are far beyond scientific consensus on this topic, meaning that vitamin D is absolutely essential and effective against the initiation and progression and fatal termination of COVID-19 infections. So what we're faced with here is political stagnation, not scientific stagnation. But of course, some of that research is politically motivated, and I'll show you some examples of that. Let's look at this very important study published last year in Journal of Steroid Biochemistry and Molecular Biology in 2020. This was published in August out of southern Spain. This is a pilot study starting with 76 patients with COVID-19 in an area of Spain that typically has a vitamin D level below 15 nanograms per milliliter. And so what they did here was a little bit unusual in both dosing and the type of vitamin D that they used. They used 25-hydroxyvitamin D. They did not use vitamin D3. They used the semi-activated or activated form, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, and they administered it in somewhat of an unusual way. Their tablets or their capsules were 266 micrograms, so patients received 2 of those doses on the first day, and then 1 on the 3rd day, 1 on the 7th day, and 1 on the 14th day. And what they showed here was greater survival and less need for intensive care unit treatment. So this is excellent initial data, and from this point forward, if we're really going to take COVID-19 seriously as a pandemic infection, this one study was actually sufficient to initiate action. From this point forward, the international medical and political so-called communities could have reasonably started using vitamin D treatment preventatively and therapeutically, rather than sit and do nothing, wait for a crisis, telling these patients to go home until they're more sick, and then come back for emergency care that always results in higher mortality. So we could have taken action on this for more than a year, but the international medical and political so-called communities actively did nothing. They actively suppressed this information. Here's another study published in the British Medical Journal's Postgraduate Medical Journal 2020 November. This is a population of 40 patients with mild COVID-19 and vitamin D deficiency. They were treated with 60,000 international units per day to reach an optimal 25-hydroxyvitamin D level of at least 50 nanograms per milliliter, which is exactly the same as what I recommended about 10 years ago in a publication for the American Chiropractic Association. The beneficial effect included the fact that 62% of participants in the intervention group receiving vitamin D versus 20% in the control arm became COVID-19 negative within a period of 2 weeks. So that is showing you a direct antiviral effect of vitamin D against COVID-19. Again, that is showing you a direct and clinically important direct antiviral effect of vitamin D against COVID-19. Fibrinogen levels were also decreased. So again, patients receiving vitamin D3 experienced triple the improvement in terms of becoming negative for COVID-19, and we all have to agree that that's one of the major goals, is to make people virus negative so they don't have the virus and they're also not transmitting it. So here again was another international game changer that was actively ignored and suppressed by medical groups and politicians, essentially all of whom are paid by Big Pharma. My opinion is that denying this line of research, now confirmed multiple times by multiple international investigators, is a crime against all humans who are affected by lockdowns, travel, work, and leisure restrictions, and loss of income and the right to live their lives normally. So now let's look at another study using activated or semi-activated vitamin D in the form of 25-hydroxyvitamin D. This was conducted in 537 patients who are hospitalized with COVID-19. So again, this is another study out of Spain using 25-hydroxyvitamin D among hospitalized COVID-19 patients. And the effect of supplementation was a 78% reduction in death. Again, if this were a drug, it would be considered a miracle. And I think very positively of these researchers. I think of them as global patriots trying to save the world by showing the world that this pandemic viral infection can be easily managed by the use of competent vitamin D supplementation. It's safe, it's beneficial, it's available, it's agreeable, and I think that if we were to just do it, we would change the course of this so-called global pandemic. Let's look at another study here. This is from Journal of Endocrinology and Metabolism 2021. This is another remarkable study published out of Spain involving 838 COVID-19 hospitalized patients at the Hospital del Mar in Barcelona. And the effect is an 87% reduction in intensive care unit admission and a 79% reduction in mortality. These results are the most superior in terms of reduced ICU utilization, reduced mortality, and cost effectiveness that have ever been documented for any therapy against COVID-19, to the best of my knowledge. And here we are again. From this point forward, the international medical and political communities should have reasonably started using vitamin D in the prevention and treatment of COVID-19 rather than sit and do nothing, wait for the continuation of the crisis, and then use emergency care with high mortality. So if you want to look at these results graphically, they look like this. This is the 15% mortality without vitamin D reduced to a 5% mortality with vitamin D, along with an 87% reduction in intensive care unit utilization. So that represents massive savings in healthcare utilization and expense, again with a 79% reduction in death. If this had been a drug study or a vaccine study, these researchers would have won the Nobel Prize, but because it was a vitamin D study, it was ignored. So that brings us to a close today. Remember, we've been talking about this now for 17 years at least, talking about the importance of giving patients the vitamin D that they need so we can avoid the disease predispositions that are predictable and which contribute to these global pandemics of various types of disease, not simply COVID-19. So this was published last year in Nutrients in November of 2020. Vitamin D insufficiency may account for almost 9 of 10 COVID-19 deaths. Time to act. Given the dynamics of the COVID-19 pandemic and the proven safety of vitamin D supplementation, it therefore appears highly debatable and potentially even unethical to await results of such trials even before public health action is taken, but we already have the clinical studies and I've reviewed them with you here. So again, for acute dosing, we use 60,000 international units per day for 14 days, or we use the semi-activated form of 25-hydroxyvitamin D at roughly the equivalent of 5,000 to 9,000 international units per day. We know that this is safe, beneficial, available, agreeable, and therefore clinically justified. So thank you very much for your attention. This has been part number 5 in my clinical review of vitamin D deficiency in adults, this time focusing on antimicrobial defense versus nutritional neglect based on the mountain of research we have showing the many benefits of vitamin D supplementation. Thank you very much. And again, this has been Dr. Alex Vasquez, and I look forward to sharing more research with you soon. Meanwhile, please take a look at my blog at healthythinking.substack.com. You can also find my books in all major booksellers worldwide, and you can also see more information on my other main website, which is inflammationmastery.com. Thank you again.